Livingstone. I'm a current postdoctoral scholar with the Ethnic Immigration and Pluralism Studies program at the Munk School under the leadership of Dr. Jeff Wrights. And it's my pleasure this morning to moderate a panel and conversation on the question of police surveillance technology and the transformation of public space. We have an exciting group of individuals, all of whom are current research fellows at the Citizen Lab, Cynthia Khoo, Bría Mathis, and Todd Whitney. And so they will be speaking to us about research that they've done or are planning to do that touches on the question of technology, surveillance technology, and transformations in public space. And what I think is particularly exciting for us as audience members is that each one of these speakers brings not just an academic knowledge to the subject, but actual practical experiences as lawyers, as community organizers, as artists themselves. And so that should give us an opportunity to have a rich discussion at the end once they've spoken about their individual projects. And so I'd like to mention that there will be, each speaker will be talking for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And you may submit your questions on the special tab that says Q&A on the Zoom page. So without further ado, I'll just briefly introduce our individual speakers and then we'll start. So Cynthia Khoo will go first, and she's a co-author of a report that looks at predictive policing in Canada and algorithmic, sorry. The language is very new to me, algorithmic surveillance. A very important report that was released recently in Canada and has received considerable news coverage. Cynthia is a lawyer who obtained her degree at University of Ottawa. Bría Mathis come to us from New York. She is currently at the NYU Robert Wagner Graduate School of Public Policy. She has extensive experience working in public policy as a community organizer. And so she's going to be talking to us about a new, I guess you could say, piece of legislation or a new initiative developed in New York City to make police surveillance data available to the public. So this is a groundbreaking development, and Bría is going to be following the implementation of that policy and talking to us about it today. And then finally, but not least, is Todd, who is studying the impact of police surveillance on hip hop artists and the hip hop community. He too is a graduate student at the at NYU and is currently based in New York City. Is that right, Todd? Also, great. Yep. And so what's interesting about Bría and Todd is that they'll give us a chance to reflect on, how might these questions that they're raising apply in the Canadian context. As we know, Canada and the US have often followed each other in terms of their innovations, and I use that word critically in policing. And so I'm sure their research will have much to offer us in reflecting on Canadian context. So we shall begin with Cynthia.
Just going to make sure to unmute my mic. Thank you so much for that introduction. To give some context, I will start off by giving people a bit of the background of the project and the report that I worked on, and then go into some of our factual findings and an extremely high-level legal analysis with respect to transformation of public space. So first off, this report, To Survey and Predict, a Human Rights Analysis of Algorithmic Policing in Canada, was not just a Citizen Lab project, it was a joint project between the Citizen Lab and our colleagues at the International Human Rights Program at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. And specifically, there were 3 of us leading this project. Along with myself, there was Kate Robertson, who is also a Citizen Lab Fellow, who couldn't be here today. And she is a criminal defense attorney based in Toronto, as well as Yolanda Song, who is a civil litigator also based in Toronto and a research associate at the IHRP at U of T. So we worked on this project together for about 1.5 to 2 years, and it was a multi-pronged research project. We conducted preliminary desk research to see what kind of documents we could find that were already available online. We relied heavily on FOI, Freedom of Information requests. So we sent out access to information requests federally to all relevant law enforcement departments and provincially to British Columbia, Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan at the provincial level in terms of their ministries of corrections and attorneys general, and to municipal police services as well. We also conducted formal research interviews with community representatives, human rights lawyers, racial justice activists to see what were their perspectives on algorithmic policing technologies, and interviews with law enforcement representatives who are using these technologies to see what was actually happening, verify our findings, and what were their takes on it. And this was all done under a formal research ethics protocol at U of T. And then, of course, we applied legal fund policy research and analysis to all of our findings, not just Canadian human rights and constitutional law, but we also used international human rights law. And looked abroad too. So we looked at what was happening in the United States, what was happening in the United Kingdom, because all of this is still very much emerging in Canada, whereas it has been in place already for quite a few years in the US and UK. So very much engaging in a kind of lessons learned approach as well. In terms of our actual findings, just factually, what did we find? Well, we classified the technologies into two categories. First is what popularly known as predictive policing technologies, although it's kind of a misnomer because it's not a certain prediction, it's more of a statistical generalized forecast. And in this case, we found two major examples. The first one was a location-focused predictive policing algorithm, which the Vancouver Police Department uses, known as GeoDash. It predicts the top 6 neighborhoods in Vancouver where property crime is predicted to happen every 2 hours. And then an example of person-based predictive policing that we found is the Saskatchewan Police Predictive Analytics Lab in Saskatchewan, based at the Saskatoon Police Services. And it's actually an entirely public funded venture between the province of Saskatchewan, the University of Saskatchewan, and the Saskatoon Police Service. And they are currently trying to predict quote unquote at-risk people, so future victims such as runaways, for example, but they have said in the future they want to move on to trying to predict repeat and violent offenders or addressing other issues such as the opioid crisis, for example. This lab, though, is not live yet, it's still very much in the R&D stage. The other category of technologies we found are algorithmic surveillance. So these are categories that don't necessarily have a predictive element, but they still engage equal, if not more, human rights concerns because of the ubiquitous and invasive surveillance that they enable cops to monitor everyone with. And the specific examples we found in Canada are facial recognition technology, automated license plate readers, social media surveillance, and social network analysis. I can go into more details in those in the Q&A as they come up. So we provided a fairly comprehensive legal analysis of all of these findings in our report. We analyzed it through the lens of multiple key human rights and constitutional rights, specifically the right to privacy, the right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and free association, the right to liberty and to be free from being arbitrarily detained, and the right to equality, as well as the right to due process and remedy, but those kind of come later. So in terms of what the public space implications are of each of these, I'll just highlight a couple points quickly, and again, we can dive deeper in the Q&A for those who are interested. With respect to the right to privacy, what these technologies do is they essentially curtail our right to privacy in the form of anonymity. We're used to being able to walk down the street and trust that even if an acquaintance may coincidentally see us, or someone might see that someone of our description walked down the street, that's not the same as being able to expect that there's a drone with facial recognition capabilities, for example, I'm extrapolating, that can instantly identify who you are, or that there are other tools that the state can use to identify exactly who you are. And anonymity provides a certain measure of protection when it comes to free expression, for example. So you'll see that all of the rights are connected as well. While anonymity is generally a privacy right, it's a precondition of being able to fully express your right to freedom of expression. And we see this in the form of public protests, for example, that anonymity provides protection from reprisals from employers, from the people from the state, for example. But again, if you can no longer attend a public protest without expecting that a facial recognition system is going to identify who you are, and then law enforcement agencies are going to crawl through all of your social media activities to try and target you, then you're more likely to self-censor and to not express yourself as fully as you might on matters of civil rights or of political importance, for example. The third implication for the right of liberty, for example, is when it comes to location-based predictive policing, that is a generalized statistical inference on particular neighborhoods. But that inference is used to form suspicion against specific individuals who might be walking through a neighborhood at the wrong time because somebody was sent there to patrol on the basis of an algorithm. So what happens when we can no longer walk through public space trusting that, or well, when trusting that it's no longer, suspicion is no longer tied to our characteristics and behavior, but tied to an algorithm that has nothing to do with you at all? So many people already experience this. For example, the Canadian criminal justice system is infused with historical and systemic and ongoing discrimination, particularly anti-Black and anti-Indigenous discrimination. So that this already happens, even in the absence of algorithms. And you can imagine algorithmic forecasts exacerbating this particular phenomenon, again, in public space. And then finally, when it comes to the right to equality, one thing I would highlight is so obviously the Canadian criminal justice system has involved systemic discrimination across multiple groups, across almost nearly any axis of oppression that you might think of, particularly racial discrimination, but also those who are socioeconomic disadvantaged, those who live in poverty, for example, or who are homeless. And this comes down to the idea of hypervisibility. If you do not have a home, for example, and there are no indoor spaces where you're allowed to exist because they're commercialized, then you are just out on the streets in public space because you have nowhere else to go, and therefore more visible to be policed by any particular officer who happens to be walking down the street looking for signs of suspicion or criminal activity that they are told has a high likelihood of happening. That's the physical sense of public space. But what happens when it comes to algorithmic policing is that these individuals then become digitally hypervisible as well. Because if you have to rely on government services and social welfare to meet your survival needs, Virginia Eubanks, in her books Automating Inequality, has shown how people are required to exchange massive amounts of personal data in exchange for food stamps, for housing needs met, for example. And so you have their data proliferating through all these government agencies that then may have channels to law enforcement. And so their data is just, as Sarah Brain says, lying in wait in these databases to come up as subjects of suspicion in future potential searches and investigations. So those are just some of the few highlights for our report as they relate specifically to transformation of public space and how we might think about it. And I look forward to the discussion later on. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Cynthia. Hey, everyone, I'm Todd. I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that I've been doing for the past month and a half on my fellowship with Citizen Lab. And the focus of my research is on the New York City Police Department and its practices of being able to, surveilling and targeting like young rappers, local rappers, and using their creative output and their social media profiles against them and leveraging that against them as evidence for criminal activities in court. So I'm interested in that, and not just what the police department is doing, the NYPD is doing, but also importantly, the way that this type of like surveillance lands heavy on communities, and especially like a lot of the rappers, and seeing if there are any cooling effects on the way that rappers think about their arts practice, the way they think about who they collaborate with, how they want to go about making their art. So I think, just being Black in America is just to constantly be in a state of being scrutinized and surveilled. And I think that's something a lot more people are starting to realize after the uprisings of this past summer. But if you wanted to get that up a notch from like not just being like a regular Black person, but being somebody there's been a long tradition in America of law enforcement, both federal and local, and using their ability to try and surveil Black artists as members of communities who oftentimes bring group cohesion, create art that inspire people. And so we witnessed different programs over, a long trajectory of history of being Black in America and being surveilled. But in particular, over the past 30 years, there's been a special emphasis on the role of like rappers and rap and its place in American society. But aside, the focus of my research isn't about the last 30 years. I'm more so interested in the past decade or so. And I think there's been a big shift. There's been a big twist in what we're witnessing in the sense of a lot of social media monitoring on the part of the police. I think one of the things that we witnessed before, I think when it comes to surveillance of rappers, a lot of the accounts and discussions tend to center around like more established rappers, people who've been around a little bit longer, have like a little bit longer of a career. But one of the things that I'm witnessing when it comes to NYPD surveillance, so like the social media accounts of local rappers, is the fact that these aren't kids who are established. A lot of them are literally kids, teenagers, people who are just looking to rap and not trying to become like the next Jay-Z or become like the next Drake or anything like that, so much as they are just trying to do something that a lot of people seem to be doing on a day-to-day basis, which is making music, sharing it, making videos, putting it out there for other people to enjoy, just hoping to participate in the online attention economy and make, help hopefully gain like a little bit of micro celebrity, which is something that I think all of us do each and every single day. But one of the things that we're witnessing when it comes to NYPD surveillance is the way that some people, young Black youth, are being criminalized for this practice. And so that's a big part of my focus. That's a big part of my research, is looking at not just what the police department is doing here in New York, but also importantly, the ways that a lot of young people, a lot of young rappers and the people around them, the way that they deal with this type of surveillance. So yeah, I think there are three main things that I'm like hitting on in this in my research. It's the NYPD practices, how what the police department is doing, how it impacts rappers and their art, and also the communities that they live in. So in the part for like the police department, one of the things that I'm finding is like there seems to be like really broad and permissive use of using social media in criminal investigations. And what I mean by that is there really aren't like a lot of checks. And so one of the things that we see with that I'm witnessing with the police department in New York is the fact that anything that people put up on and post on social media they deem that to be fair game. It's sort of like able for like public consumption. And this the Chicago Police Department, they call it open source intelligence. So anything that somebody publishes to social media, they feel that they can use in criminal investigations. And I think that's something that we might want to reconsider, something we want to think about. Might be something we talk about a little bit later in the Q&A. But for right now, just thinking about the practices that the police department actually engages in, a lot of it is corralling a lot of the networks and a lot of the social contacts that a lot of young rappers, people that they're associating with. So monitoring different social media platforms, from Facebook to Twitter to Snapchat to Instagram to YouTube, and then looking at the likes, the shares, the comments, people who are engaging with the different profiles of rappers, and also like looping them into, entangling them into different forms of surveillance as well. One of the big things I'm seeing with like rappers though, when it comes to their creative output, is there are teams of NYPD detectives that are dedicated to trying to understand what's going on the streets. And so their shorthand for that is to look at rappers as sort of like more or less kind of like community griots, and trying to understand exactly what's going on based on their public facing personas and their profiles, and trying to get a good understanding of like what's going on in different neighborhoods. One of the problems with that is obviously the fact that you can't take literally everything that somebody posts on social media. And this is one of the big logical leaps that I'm witnessing with the police department, and the way that they explain away their thinking behind this social media monitoring is the fact that, yeah, somebody's putting it up on social media, it kind of must be true. And there seems to be not just trying to wait and see, like trying to understand like what's actually going on in communities. One of the dangers of this process is you can actually like see like an editing and like a making of games through the process of going through and selectively like editing different aspects of people's personalities and combining different aspects of the social media personas to create the type of dossier the digital dossier that you want. So aside from just like checking out, looking who's associated with whom in different YouTube videos, because one of the things that a lot of rappers are going to do, if you're 14, 15 years old, you make a song, you put it up on SoundCloud, and then you're going to need a video to support that, right? You make a video, you meet up with a bunch of homies, wherever you have the opportunity to make a video. Usually that's somewhere in public space, somewhere outdoors in the Bronx, some different parts of Brooklyn and in Harlem. you make the video, you put it up on YouTube. And then one of the unintended audiences, again, are the police department, the NYPD. And with that, one of the things that teams of detectives are doing are they're in this monitoring of especially YouTube videos, they will try and gain an understanding of who's associated with whom, who's beefing with who, who's cooling with who, based on how people are relating to each other, who's appearing in whose videos on YouTube, and also deciphering lyrics and having detectives sit back and actually trying to understand what's going on based on trying to decipher lyrics and get an understanding of what's happening in the streets. And so I think this should obviously have a very big cooling effect on the creation of art. And for a lot of these local rappers, a lot of these young kids, knowing the fact that they're surveilled, knowing that they're being targeted for nothing more than exactly a lot of the things that we're always doing, I've sort of expected to find that there's been a big cooling effect. But in fact, one of the things that I think I've been coming across so far, and a big part of my research I still want to do, is speaking to more rappers, more activists, more attorneys who are trying to help them out, is understand exactly how this is changing their creative process, changing who they're collaborating with, if this, knowing that they're being studied, knowing that they're being tracked, if this is going to have anything to do with the way that how they cook up their lyrics, who they want to collaborate with, how they engage with not just public space, but in a very real way, deciding on who they want to associate with. And getting into this, one of the things I find is really interesting is the fact that, a lot of kids understand this is happening. And I think going back to one of the things I said earlier was the fact that being Black in America is to be surveilled. A lot of these kids who are getting into rap at 14, 15 years old, they've already internalized that very sober fact. And so a lot of them don't seem to be interested in trying to change around change around their arts practice and flip the script on what it is that they're doing and trying to evade the creepy eye of the NYPD. But one of the things that they're doing just seems to be going with the flow and trying to make the best out of a situation. And this is a really big part of the project that I really want to focus on. I don't just want it to be an example of different programs that the police department has that's targeting young Black youth, but I think there's an untapped wisdom that a lot of young rappers have, in the sense of what they're doing is the fact that in an age of surveillance capitalism, where none of us can avoid the gaze of companies or government surveillance, one of the things I find really interesting and compelling about what a lot of young rappers are doing is they understand what's happening, but they're not going to force it to let them flip their script. They seem to carry on. They carry a lot of dignity with them. They continue to make, they continue to create, they continue to kick it with homies. And they do all of this in the face of knowing that one of their unintended audiences is the police. I think this is really cool. And I think this is going to be a big part of the next big push in my research project, is linking up with more and more rappers and understanding exactly all the small little ways that they continue to just make do with a really not so good situation. And then briefly, yeah, aside from the rappers and the police, I think one of the things I've also come across in my research so far is the fact that when it comes to, I think rappers are kind of just the opening salvo. One of the things that I've been researching is the way that the NYPD they use the public-facing personas of the rappers to track the people who are engaging with their music and their art online the most, and then they highlight those as potential new nodes of surveillance and new people of building digital dossiers on. And so the mere fact of liking a video or sharing, if you have a friend who's a rapper, they post a video on YouTube, you end up sharing that video, that can become a red flag for certain detectives in the police department. And that can just be a pretext for them further surveillance. And so this isn't just about rappers. The tentacles actually dig deeper into communities. And that's something that I intend to research more and then hopefully talk about a little bit more right now, a little bit later during the Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you, Todd. That was really interesting. And it makes me think that, we've always known that rap is has been expressed as it's the people who feel voiceless, right? Who use it as a means to be seen, to be heard. And so it's a form of resistance. And so your research is showing how the connection between surveillance, art, and resistance in an interesting way. Okay, Bría, why don't we move on to you? Thank you.
Sure. Hello, everyone. So as Anne-Marie mentioned, my research is on the POSTAC, which stands for Public Oversight of Surveillance Technology. It is a legislation that was recently passed in June and signed into local law in New York City in July. So what that means is that this is a law that's only at the New York City level and was passed by New York City's legislative body known as City Council. And it was, it's been a landmark thing to happen because for so long, people have not known, what the NYPD is up to, what surveillance technologies they have, how it's being used in court, which is something that Todd alluded to, with people not knowing like what information is being collected on them and then what could be used against them in court. And so what the POST Act does is it requires the NYPD to disclose their surveillance technologies. So what it is, what they use it for, how they use it, who has access to this information, which has like a lot of implications for ICE when we're talking about immigration and whether the NYPD is sharing this information with other channels and the FBI, right? Also has to talk about like, what are the potentials for like disparate impacts? Are there more communities who are getting this surveillance than others? And then talking about protected groups, right? Like what are the impacts on race, gender, religion is a big one, because a few years ago, there's an independent office called the Office of the Inspector General, which is interesting because it's independent, but it's within the NYPD, and their job is to really look at systemic issues within NYPD, and they come out with these reports and they make recommendations. And one of the reports that came out in 2016 found that 95% of police surveillance was on Muslim communities. So different religious communities also have stake in this legislation too. So what will happen is that the NYPD will post these, their impact and use policies is what they're called, that will kind of like outline the technology and how it's used and all those details. That will be posted as long as things stick to the timeline mid next month, so in mid-December. And then what happens next is there's this public commentary period, which I find really cool because a lot of my background has been in community organizing and gathering community input, and how do you get communities to co-create their realities and talk about what they envision for their communities. Particularly, I worked in Harlem, so working with Black and Brown communities to think about like how they see themselves in public space and what that means to them and what makes them feel like they belong and what makes it feel inclusive. So the public will then have the opportunity to talk about this. So what the next stage of my research is, a lot of it's been like gathering background, gathering more context, has been how will community organizations and others kind of like galvanize around this? How will they talk about it? There were a lot of advocacy organizations that were involved in pushing the POST Act through, and basically what will be the messaging around it, and then how will people engage with this? During COVID-19, I have been seeing like how community input sessions have been happening with like local government agencies now that everything has moved online. So like, how will people engage online with, giving this input, I think will be really interesting. And so the POST Act, like all legislation, doesn't just get passed overnight, right? So this legislation was initially introduced in 2016 by two council members who sat on the Community Safety Committee within New York City Council and thought that it was really important. However, they couldn't get it anywhere. It stalled. And then over the summer, with the protests that we saw happening in New York City, and not just with the protests, we saw police brutality, we saw surveillance technology in action. We saw videos of people just being kind of picked up and taken away by police and not knowing what was going on. So with all of this happening, it gave this legislation new life, and kind of like a window of passage. And it was able to pass with most of the council members siding with it. And the POST Act was just like a bundle of like other policy legislation, which was kind of called police accountability package. So it was also looking at disciplinary things, recording the police. Police officers sometimes will shield their badges. So the POST Act was a part of like larger efforts to really push through a lot of legislation over the summer to reckon or begin to kind of reckon with NYPD surveillance and police tactics. So as I'm getting into this and really looking at the local law, because words are important, looking at language, looking at the way that things are phrased, there are some challenges and things that I thought like, this will be interesting. So basically, as it stands right now, the NYPD will go through all their surveillance technologies based on the definition that is included in the local law, what is categorized. They'll decide what they then create the impact and use policies on, right? So there's no other body that goes in and audits and looks through the files and says, okay, this is surveillance technology to make sure that they're capturing everything. So that was like one, kind of concern that came up. And then the other one is with this public commentary period, which will launch hopefully in like another month or so. The recommendations that they get from the public, there's no real kind of description on how to be integrated. All it really says is that, oh, the NYPD commissioner will review it. And then I guess they themselves will decide what's worth it and what's not. And I feel like that's also a concern. And then the Office of the Inspector General that I mentioned earlier, that's supposed to look at these systemic issues within the NYPD, they're within the local law supposed to be like the annual audit. Then they're supposed to annually look at the impact and use policies and make sure that the NYPD is in compliance. But again, what they do is pure recommendations. They can't make the NYPD do anything in terms of like compliance and sanctioning. They don't have that power. And I think that is something that New York City is trying to reckon with, because they're realizing that, thinking about disciplinary action, is it public? How are we making sure and the officers are complying with the things that, that legislators are passing is also really important. So my research is going to look at not just the implementation of the Post Act, but like, how is it supported? What are the challenges? What are some structures that are in place or policies that, could pose some issues or maybe make this a bit difficult. But, as I was reading it, I was like, trying to also think about all the opportunities this presents, right? NYPD, largest police force, huge budget, and what it means to have this legislation be there for us to at least have disclosure of information, like what it can mean for people who are on trial, who are served, with, papers for something, and they're trying to figure out how did they get this information, where did this come from, and now like lawyers having a basis, now advocates saying like, okay, we have something to go off of, we're not having that before. And so I think it's really important to critique policy too, because over the summer a lot of activists and people are like, we're tired of the Black Lives Matter murals, right? Like, talk to us in policy, talk to us in actual like change. And when we get the policy, I think we can often celebrate, and we should, but then we also have to look at like, what does it actually say, right? Like, how will it be implemented? What are some concerns? And one of the council members that passed this legislation, in reading through several testimonies, she kept saying, this is the floor, not the ceiling, right? So the city council created this knowing that this is like foundational, in hopes that this, I think, will spur other things that are stronger, and looking at maybe moving, like for the instance, the Office of the Inspector General, the Attorney General for New York State, Letitia James suggested making that office actually independent, completely removing it from under the NYPD. So I think people are starting to think more about like, how can we pass policy that's effective, but then how are we creating structures so that it can actually be effective? And when we talk about public space and how that transforms things, and thinking about like, how do they feel, how do people feel, right, when they show up to a protest? The fact that I all of a sudden saw guides and things on like how to protest, and like covering your face and leaving your phone at home, like these are people thinking about surveillance technology, and then it inhibiting how they can show up, what they can post after a protest, and all these things. So that's kind of more in the physical space. And I think the digital space, people are still kind of learning and understanding like privacy information and what's being collected and what implications that has. So I think knowing is like the first part of then deciding, what do we do? How do we create stronger things? So I'm really excited to hear from folks and hear what questions they have, and talk more about the Post Act.
Thank you very much, Bría. And thank you, all three of you. Okay, well, I think we're going to open it up for Q&A. But just to maybe launch the discussion, I mean, I think your presentations raise a lot of questions for us, and questions about public policy, about privacy and rights. And what I hear from the three of you is that, you know, the sort of expansion of surveillance technology, the increasing sophistication is allowing, you know, law enforcement to increase its, I guess, targeting of specific groups, be they Muslims, be they Black, be they, I don't know, political activists. But I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about, I imagine that, you know, surveillance has implications for all of us, right? Like sort of anybody, white, Black, and middle class, and working class, and so on, but also for specific groups. So how would you differentiate between, I guess, you know, the larger implications of these increasing forms of surveillance for all of us, and for these specific, for already vulnerable groups?
I guess I can start off,
Yeah.
and then if Bría or Todd can add after. So that's a really good point, that there is definitely the two levels of impacts, I suppose. And one is kind of the issues that I spoke to earlier, where if it's a matter of escalation. So for example, if at this point in time you feel like you are not really subjected to police scrutiny, you can go about your day, you can walk down the streets, but now you know that police are using a range of technologies that can algorithmically survey us, survey our cars, survey our social media activities, survey our faces. Then depending on what kind of person you are, if you happen to be more risk averse, then you may start to self-censor, be a little bit more careful. There are other people though who so something that often comes up when it comes to privacy issues, particularly of state surveillance, is, well, I have nothing to hide, therefore I don't care about this stuff, it doesn't impact me. And there are many things, many responses that people have written and stated in response to this particular point of view. But it's not a helpful response, because on the one hand, you may not have anything to hide now, but in the future you may. It depends on what is defined as suspicious or what is criminalized. Think of all the things that used to be considered criminal activities, rightly or wrongly, and today are no longer considered criminal activity, and other things in the future that are today criminalized may not be. The second line of response to that is that it's not about hiding, it's about having a zone of autonomy and a zone of human flourishing, which you can do even if it's not a secret. So I think it's Edward Snowden who famously said, it's not a secret that you go to the bathroom, but everyone still closes the door. And so that is a good way to distinguish between secrecy and privacy. And then the third thing I would say, and this is where the idea of equality and marginalized groups come in, is that, okay, even if you do believe in the construction of nothing to hide, and you have that very narrow definition of privacy and don't see it in the more expansive way as an element of human dignity to which we're all entitled, then sure, you may not have anything to hide at this point in time, and you trust that you will never have anything to hide, but that doesn't mean other people have that privilege and have that power. If someone happens to be wealthy, living in a suburb, they are white, they are not engaged in political activity, then they may very well not be impacted by surveillance, although there is some, still goes, I believe, to the human autonomy aspect. But this doesn't mean, that doesn't account at all for political activists, for Black communities, LGBT communities, people with mental illness, Muslims, people who have been historically ongoingly targeted and surveyed by the state. And so these tools will only empower those pre-existing forms of targeting and discrimination and exacerbate pre-existing targeting. And one of the questions I believe asked about what the tech does, and that's actually usually the first point that comes up in any discussion of algorithmic policing, which is that the tech itself is shown to be biased and discriminatory along lines of gender, along lines of race. So for example, when it comes to facial recognition, two scholars at MIT, Joy Bulamwini and Timnit Jabru, have shown that I think facial recognition misidentifies darker skinned women 1 in 3 times, while it has a 99.8% accuracy rate for white men. So if you imagine this deployed in a criminal justice context, you can, and multiplied across populations and over time, you can imagine that feedback loop that happens over time is once you're seen as suspicious, then you're only more likely to be seen as suspicious in the future. So it basically, for people who may not have had to worry before in terms of the general public, they now may have to be more worried. And then for people who already had concern, who were already aware of state surveillance before it became cool because they had already been subjected to it historically, it just ups the ante on all the pre-existing concerns.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Bría and Todd, if you want to add do you want to add anything?
I wanted to, but I think Cynthia nailed it. She got it.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. You're nodding, Bría. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. There's a question from the audience for you, Bría. It says, to what degree are protesters looking to or learning from similar protest tactics in other parts of the world, i.e. Hong Kong?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I was just trying to filter back and think too, because unfortunately we've had, so many Black and brown bodies murdered by the police, right? And trying to figure out which protest was it. And I'm thinking that it was when Michael Brown was murdered, right? Or I think it was when Michael Brown was murdered where protesters were in the streets. And I think that they were getting information and learning from folks out in Palestine, like, right? Like what to do with if you're tear gas. And I think that with social media, being able to exchange information very quickly has been like helpful for folks who this is an entry point to their activism. For some people, there are community organizers on the ground who have been doing this for years. Over the summer in New York City, I saw friends and folks who had never engaged in protesting all of a sudden wanting to go, but, kind of, I guess you could say like needing to know the rules of the road, right? Like, how to protest in a way that's safe, that protects you, that protects those around you that you may not know. And talking about like how to film at protests and what you shouldn't. I've actually a lot of very interesting videos with like how the protesters in Hong Kong coordinate. And I think that we, folks are trying to take what they can internationally. And then also particularly with New York City, the NYPD is a lot. It's a lot. They have all these different techniques, one called Kettling. The Bronx, like, so over the summer, the Bronx decided to organize their first, or I shouldn't say their first, but kind of wanted to draw upon what was happening in other boroughs and made a protest, and a whole bunch of folks got kettled where you basically like get cornered from all angles. And then a lot of folks were arrested, right? A borough that is heavily Black and brown communities, where poverty and other struggles have an over-policing, right? So I think my concern is also what it is for someone who is from a community that is impoverished, that is over-policed, to then be organizing protests and then going to protests, and how different that is for someone who may identify as white or has more means, right? Because what happens when you get arrested is a real question, right? So we've seen all the donations for folks who are out when the George Floyd protests started and bail money, like that's really real. And so thinking about like how can we be preventative in our protesting and how can we be smart is just one step. But people should have the freedom to protest peacefully, because all of these protests are peaceful, right? They become dangerous when the police get involved and begin to interact. So I think that that's a key point to make too, right? Like these are peaceful protests that people are organizing, but I also want to say that folks also have the right to be upset. So, protesting and how people are expressing their hurt and their pain, should not kind of end in a way, or people should not feel that they're limited in the way that they can express themselves. So I think that we're learning, and New York City has learned a lot over the summer. And I think that a lot of people feel like this is just the beginning. So I think a lot of it is planning long-term and like playing like the long game and thinking about that.
Sorry, I keep on forgetting to unmute myself. This is a question. So the next question comes from somebody who says she works with youth in sort of low-income areas of the city. And she says that while some of the youth might take the initiative to look at how algorithmic policing and surveillance impacts their lives, many do not. What would you say is a good way to start the conversation? I guess she's asking, she's asking, what's the best way to start the conversation with the young people? And how do you enable these young people to engage in affecting changes, you know, positive changes in policy, so that, I guess, protect their rights? How would, who would like to respond to that?
I guess I will, to get it started. Yeah, that's a good question. I think the thing is kind of simple. It's just honestly just checking in about kids about how they're engaging with their social media profiles. I mean, one of the really big things, and it's not just about an individual, but it's also about when we start talking about social network analysis and talking about different relationships and the way that people relate to one another, it's not just considering what are you doing to protect yourself and your own online engagement, but also considering the people that you're affiliated with and that you socialize with online. Also, I'm just like talking with them about making sure that, you know, everybody's doing their part to keep everybody else safe. Because it's not just about an individual, but it's about everybody doing their part. Oh no.
Did we lose Todd there for a second?
I think.
Yeah,
oh.
I'm back though now, right?
Okay,
yes.
yeah.
I'm live? Cool, sweet. Yeah, I don't know where I left off, but yeah, I think a big thing is not just talking to kids on an individual level, but the important thing is to also talk to them about the people in their networks and how safe they are, and thinking about considering what the types of information that they're putting out there. And often, I think really just one of the best ways is just to, rather than thinking about it and hey, like, why would you do anything like this? This is one of the things I think that I've encountered a little bit about when it comes to the idea of like open source intelligence or whatever. A lot of people are saying, well, why kids shouldn't post, they shouldn't put stuff out there. I don't think that's realistic. I think what it means to participate in public life in 2020 is to be involved in creating digital media. You're going to be, if you don't have your own arts practice, you have some sort of brand or whatever that you're trying to keep up on your different social media profiles. So the expectation that kids wouldn't participate in, especially when they feel this need to do that, the need to promote their stuff in order to, do the kinds of things that they want to do with their art and with their life. It's not a reasonable expectation to think that they won't do these things. So I think just starting a conversation and being like, yo, how do you engage? Like, what are you, like, who are you engaging with? How are you going about it? Because this is also like one of the things that I found in the research that I've been doing is I think when we start thinking about social media use, we usually think about different groups of people engaging, utilizing social platforms in a really similar way. But it's not true. Black youth, they use social media a lot more than white youth, and they also put it to different types of uses, different forms of like community cohesion. And I think it's part of that process is to, think about the fact that it's kids are gonna they're gonna make stuff, they're gonna create, they're gonna want to share. And it's just a matter of trying to get a good understanding and talk to kids about, hey, just so you know, this kind of thing is going on, and what are you thinking about? You know, how are you thinking about protecting yourself, and how are you thinking about protecting others?
Yeah. Thank you, Todd.
I might.
Anybody else? Yes, Cynthia.
Sure. Yeah, just to add on to that. So what Todd said about telling kids to just stay off the internet to keep themselves safe as an unhelpful response resonated so much, because in other work that I've been working on outside of the lab on tech facilitated violence, that is one of the #1 things that people who do not understand tech facilitated violence say to women, in terms of, if you want to protect yourself, if you don't want rape threats and death threats online, if you don't want to be stalked through your social networks or through text, then just shut down your social media accounts, throw away your phone. And that is not a tenable response at all, especially if you think about today. There is no distinction between online and offline. You have to be online almost to participate in public, not even public life, just to run your own life privately, for job applications, to keep your relationships, to engage in community. And then on top of that, if you want to engage in public life, if you want to mobilize people, if you want to engage in activism, then it's all online. So it's not a useful response practically, and it's also a really inequitable response, because it's only people who are marginalized and targeted to begin with who will be driven off the internet, which is only one of the remaining spaces in which they can mobilize for that equality for which they're being targeted for in the first place. So just to emphasize that point, in terms of working with youth, though, I would encourage the person who asked that question to look up the work of Jane Bailey and Val Steves at the Equality Project at University of Ottawa. They've done a lot of work engaging with high school and young women and girls in the context of tech-facilitated violence, but a lot of it, I think, may apply when it comes to figuring out what to do with the safety as well as the equality and human rights of younger people online. And then the other thing in terms of how to start these conversations, I think, is just start it with them. I think it's certainly not beyond the ability of high school students or younger students to grapple with these questions. There's ways to communicate it to them. So for example, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association is putting on a conference for about 300 high schoolers in Toronto in a couple of weeks. And I'll be giving a workshop there on algorithmic policing on this exact topic, which I haven't done before, so that'll be interesting. And I'll be able to answer this question better after that. But it's just an example of how the only barrier to engaging in these issues with younger people might just be the fact that people haven't yet, but that we could easily start.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Cynthia. Bría, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that how important it is to get youth engaged civically, right? So I think, like, particularly in New York City, a lot of the ways that people can get involved with understanding what's happening at a local level in their communities is very like antiquated. It's a meeting that you show up to, and it's, you know, and a lot of people in general just don't show up. And then youth also feel like, oh, that's an adult thing, or the adults don't really care what we think. So in my past job, like when we would do these community input sessions, we would have people, young ones, who would show up, and there would be a separate table for them to think about and talk through with someone. We would have teenagers come, because a lot of times they feel like they're left out of the planning process. They're left out of the thought process. And then the other part of it is like learning like how these systems work. So I remember working with like a youth sports group, and they were like, wait, what? Like, explain to me what this is. And so how does this happen? How is this voted on? And so they were like, you mean to tell me that these voluntary people from the community get elected to this board, and then they decide what capital projects and what things like get okayed in our neighborhood, or like they're looked at as like an advisory body. And so I think getting you to understand like these are kind of the processes that we're working within is also a way for them to kind of figure out, where can I engage? I know particularly in the US, I think it's in Boston, New York City has like participatory budgeting, where community members, and that includes people of all ages, depends on your local elected official, where you can actually vote on which projects get funded in your neighborhood. So I remember meeting someone on a youth panel, and she was like, we were able to vote on getting a youth center in our neighborhood as youth. Like, we were able to do that. So I thinking about how can youth participate in real ways, and giving them power. A conference that I went to earlier this year in January, we're talking about other cities in the United States where like they have a youth member who actually gets to vote. Like, they're not just on kind of like whatever the local board is, but they actually get a vote, right? And so like not just putting youth on a council or panel like as lip service, but actually giving them voting power. So I think that figuring out how to get youth involved is one touch point. And then like they maybe learn about it in school, but learning how it happens in a real way, and like how that park gets built, right? And how that building was approved, I think helps to have the pieces come together, and then can kind of start talking about like other things, surveillance tech and policing, how all these things integrate into what happens in the community by like trying to understand what's happening, policy level, civic engagement level.
Okay, thank you, Bría.
Yeah, and if I can add one more thing onto that, sorry, Anne-Marie.
No.
It's just also, yeah, thinking about communicating with like with youth, it's I think it's important also for us to just like think of the types of ideas that we have in our mind about like what's going on and what's happening. And I know when I was in high school and I was in college, like one of the predominant discussions was about the digital divide, right? the inadequate access that Black and brown kids in America have to technology and how that stifles them in their educational attainment, life opportunities, and everything else like that. To be sure, that's still absolutely a thing, right? But you know, I think we need to add like different dimensions to it, because there are a lot of Black kids who are connected to the internet. You know, in fact, you know, a lot of stuff that reaches like a viral like pitch online nowadays, oftentimes it's started by Black kids in Chicago, Atlanta, like Southeast Atlanta, coming out of like New York. It's kids are participating, they're creating content, but what they get for this is a form of digital discrimination, right? It's unequal access and attention. I think one of the things Cynthia was talking about earlier was just like this heightened visibility for being like one of the driving pulses of like the culture. And so I think for us, it's just also not just thinking about like the youth themselves and how they're conceiving of this, but also us as adults and people in the community and people trying to like look at these problems in a critical way and do something better, do something different. Is for us to just like update the way that we think about these things and not just fall back on thinking about, okay, we need to get all Black kids just like connected on the internet. Okay, but then what? What comes after that? If everybody, if all Black kids are connected to the internet, and if, you know, kids are making their art and they're being surveilled for it, then was that actually like a good goal in the first place? And I think we just have to talk about the discriminatory effect as we're thinking through like a lot of these issues.
Right. Well, thanks, Todd. And, you know, as you guys are talking, I'm thinking of our own work on racial profiling in Montreal. And, you know, one of the things we discovered was that, you know, racial profiling has been exacerbated by, you know, the expansion of police discretion, of, you know, what behaviors that are deemed, you know, illegal, so misdemeanors. So I guess I'm wondering, you know, in relation to this question coming about kids, minority kids in areas of Toronto, how might we see the relationship between surveillance and the other tactics, right? The police behavior on the street, all right? So does it enable them, for example, to do stop and frisk more effectively? Right? Like we know stop and frisk has been deemed unconstitutional, but are they finding ways to get around that, you know, in order to continue to catch people, you know, in minor infractions, or, you know, to repress? So is surveillance are you seeing evidence, or do you have evidence of how it's worsening racial profiling in your cities? And how we might think of that in Canada?
I'd say, just to chime in quickly, I think that, yeah, I think when I was talking earlier, I mentioned a lot of what I've been focusing on is popping up over the last decade, and different changes that the police department has had in its tactics and looking at social media. And a lot of that coincides with a lot of the celebration that was met when stop and frisk was deemed unconstitutional. I think a lot of people were just really excited about that. But again, there weren't as many people questioning about what comes next, what comes up in its place. And if stop and frisk was deemed to be like a tactic that ostensibly that the NYPD was claiming to help them, I don't know, I don't even know what the excuses are, to be honest. But at least when it comes to like the social media stuff nowadays, their ostensible reason for like engaging in this type of surveillance and social media monitoring is because they want to like curb gang violence. And so this is a situation where it seems like, yeah, we had like the end of like the demise of like one system that was like really crappy, really shady for a lot of people. But what popped up in its place is something that seems to be even like a little bit more like far reaching in terms of the amount of people who might ultimately like get wrapped up into it. And the fact that a lot of people, they don't even realize it's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is the laws are constantly changing to facilitate police, how should I say, repression. I mean, yeah. Bría, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just to add on to what Todd is saying, I think that's why the postdoc is so interesting, because I think a lot of the information that has been gathered is through like litigation or like FOIA requests. So like having to like grasp and try to figure out like and shake and see what comes out. And now having a sense or a somewhat sense of knowing, right? And so I think we're still trying to see what the impacts may be as we're learning about what is actually there.
Okay.
And I remember, reading like a New York Times article, I'm blanking on the title, but it was talking about like once stop and frisk became unconstitutional, right? All of a sudden you see the NYPD investing in predictive policing technologies and surveillance technologies, and kind of I think the piece like even mentioned it, or somewhere else that I've read, like calling it like digital stop and frisk, right? Like now NYPD just get to sit back and be behind their desk and are looking at software and are looking at social media, and this technology is essentially doing their job for them, right? But with no oversight, no understanding of if they're using past predictive patterns or ways of thinking that have bias to then inform how they're doing this work, how the consultants that they're working with are programming and making this software for them. So I think, and it's like one of those things, like, I feel like we always like have these reports come out and tell us a lot of what we already knew, right? Like it's confirmation. And I think that the research, is important. And I think what's happening now is like a lot of people were trying to get ahead of it, right? That's why you see surveillance technology ordinances popping up all over the country. And New York is a star. And then you look at places like Oakland, California, right? Where people can actually vote on whether their police department gets to buy or adopt that technology, where there's actually kind of more oversight or a bit more public community power in determining how their communities are policed and what public safety looks like. But I think this is also just like a part of a larger conversation too about like what do we want community safety to look like. And a lot of the work that I did previously was like visioning work, right? Like let's step out of our current reality and what do we envision it looking like? And then like, let's try to figure out how to work backwards. Because I know that we have a lot of challenges and, we're always trying to shoot solutions. And I think it's important that we take the time to dream and envision what we actually want things to look like. Because if not, we're constantly just going to be reactive and responding to what happens and really not shaping like, this is what we want our future to actually look like. So I think that's important too.
Well, thank you for that note of optimism, and I'm excited to hear what you find on the implementation of the Act. Let me move on to a question from the audience. This one is for Todd. Have you noticed any change in the content of the rappers' music or videos? Has there been artistic output change to acknowledge or respond to the fact that they're being monitored in this new way?
So far, what I'm seeing is no. I think the next big stage of my process, the next big part of my project is talking with more rappers about, if what's going on, if this type of surveillance actually does inflect on the way that they view their work and if they're actually going to shift things up. But so far, it seems to be like a big no. And I find like that to be like, again, like a really interesting thing, rather than trying to find some sort of evasive way of trying to get around like being tracked and followed by the authorities. There seems to be like just a sober recognition of like what's happening, and just like a steely like self-defiance of like, I'm not going to let this change the way that I'm going to go about what I'm doing. And again, I find that really interesting. And empowering, and just the way that they're committed to who they are, they're committed to their craft, and a lot of these kids seem to just want to go out and just like, because ultimately it's not just about the work, it's not just about the work itself, but it's also about the relationships that you have, right? So when we start thinking about like rap music as a creative outlet, you're not just talking about somebody sitting back and just like independently doing their own thing, but you need somebody to produce beats for you. You need a homie who's going to be a sound engineer. You're going to need somebody who knows how to shoot videos. We have like drones now that are becoming like really popular and really cool in a bunch of like local rap videos. So you need somebody who knows how to like shoot and edit drone footage. And so it's just like really big collaborative process that goes into making a song and making a video. And so the expectation of that people might shift a lot of these young kids, that they might shift what they're doing, they're not really going about it, because it's not really just about shifting the music and the lyrical content, but in a very real way, it's about changing up and shifting like the social relationships that they have and the people that they kick it with and their peer groups and the people that they kick it with after school and in school. And so I just find that really interesting because it's not just about if they were to just I don't know fall back against like the gaze of like the police department here, it wouldn't just be a cooling of like the music and the art, but in a very real way, it would change their lives, right? The way they associate with people, the way they communicate, the way they think of and associate with people in their community. So yeah, I haven't seen that. I think that so far, because it's a really big change. And it's not just about the music, but it's about the social lives of young people. And so I think it's really cool to just like see this defiance of like, they're doing this, I'm going to continue to cook though.
Well, speaking of youth civic engagement, right? Sounds like they're taking their, how should I say, doing political acts. And there's a long tradition of that in African-American community in the States. Yeah. Cynthia, there's a question for you. Has anyone done an FOI on surveillance algorithms used by police services in Canada? One issue is that the police services first deny, then later admit use.
Yes, so people have done it. We've done it. That was part of our report. So yeah. Just to go a bit more into detail into that process is we submitted a kind of template request to federal agencies, so the RCMP, Department of Justice, and so forth. And then we picked 4 provinces based on what our preliminary desk research had suggested would be the most fruitful in terms of findings. So we sent FOI requests to provincial law enforcement related ministries in British Columbia, Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. I think in hindsight, it would have been good if we had included Quebec as well, but as it was, we did these 4 provinces. And then at the city level, we submitted FOIs to the Vancouver Police Department, Toronto Police, Calgary and Edmonton Police Services, Saskatoon Police Service, and then maybe half a dozen police services in Ontario, including Toronto and Ottawa. And it was a wide spectrum of responses that we got. Some were quite forthcoming. So the VPD, we didn't have any problem with. Actually, BC overall was actually quite good with a few negotiations in terms of narrowing our request, because we really did send out a broad request. We pretty much asked for any document you have that mentions predictive policing or algorithms or facial recognition or social media between 2013, 2018. And then we get a call saying this will take us 2 years to fulfill. Would you mind narrowing the request a bit? And then we would do that. And then to other agencies, we would just get stonewalled or just not hear back from. I think the RCMP told us there'd be a 2-year backlog to process. We would also get responses saying that an agency did find responsive records, but statutory exemptions meant that they were withholding them from us. So whether it's due to privilege or due to third-party confidentiality or due to cabinet or policy-making privilege, for example. And there were also financial barriers. So one police service quoted us upwards of $9,000 to process that freedom of information request, which we couldn't pay. So there's this information that we know exists that should be publicly available and isn't, just due to that particular barrier. So transparency is a huge problem that we point out in our report and animates a lot of our recommendations. Just the fact that we didn't know about Clearview AI until a news organization in a whole other country broke that story and mentioned in one little sentence, oh, by the way, Canadian forces are their customers too. And then off we went. The fact that facial recognition was used for over a year by Toronto Police Services, nobody knew until the media broke it. The fact that RCMP was surveilling people on social media under Project Wide Awake for over 2 years, again, nobody knew until the Tyee broke that story. And actually just yesterday, the Tyee broke another story showing internal documents that the RCMP knew that they were engaging in social media surveillance, even though they didn't characterize it that way to the privacy commissioner or to the media when they were asked about it in the past. And just further details about the social media surveillance that the RCMP have been engaged in were really quite disturbing. For example, they named Project Wide Awake after the anti-mutant agency project in the X-Men. That's how the project got its name. Speaking of social network analysis and figuring out who is friends with who, apparently they have a tool that can be used to unmask people's friends list on Facebook, even if they've set those lists to private. And so the fact that so much information, almost everything we know about algorithmic policing and algorithmic surveillance in Canada comes out so long after the fact is just a huge democratic deficit of accountability, of transparency. And that's why actually one of the reasons I was so excited to have Bría join us with the postdoc, because we need something like that in Canada. We need something that just requires preemptive disclosure, not even before the technology is used, but before it's adopted, when it's even at the moment it's considered a public consultation, should be open just to decide if we should even go down that road in the first place, let alone 1 or 2 years after the fact.
Thank you, Cynthia. Well, I think we do have a number of students in the audience, you know, and I know from experience that it's very difficult to get data from police departments. I guess, would you guys have any sort of things to offer in terms of, you know, as you're going with your research, so things that you're, how should I say, tips of the trade, I guess you could say, you know, on how to study policing and get around some of those issues of lack of transparency and access to information? Is that a... Does it take like years? You know, one has to be patient, one has to be persist, one has to, I guess, seek from different sources rather than relying on one.
You know, I think there are a few different things. I think there's a way to like think about it like administratively in terms of like a project. But then again, I think about the work that I'm doing, and what I find interesting is the fact that it's not like, you know, some sort of like high-tech surveillance that NYPD is using to surveil youth. It's, again, as they consider it, volunteered information. A lot of police do the same thing. They're NYPD message boards where cops openly like communicate, let out their feelings, blow off steam and stuff like that. I spend time in those places, checking out like what's going on. These are, you know, I think there's a thing
that in Canada. I don't know. I've heard about that in the States, that you can actually listen, watch what they're sharing with each other. But I don't think in Canada.
But I mean, it's really just like flipping the script in the same way a lot of the things that they're doing, like in the targeted populations that we're talking about. You know, part of my research has also just been in a very real way of understanding like the motivations behind some of this stuff. Oftentimes it's not going to be mentioned and formally presented in documents or for like the city council and whatnot, but really just getting like a good understanding of exactly how cops are thinking about these types of things. I don't spend like a lot of time on the internet griping about this type of stuff. And so there's a lot of opportunities to be had of just flipping the master's tools on them.
And reading between the lines.
But then again, that's also one of the things that the interpretive aspect of it, that's one of the problems that the police department has. But
anybody else, tips for, you know, emerging researchers wanting to look at surveillance and policing?
And a lot of some of the things that I have found have like taken me back to like 1970s, 60s Black Panthers, like wiretaps. Like, so also thinking like Todd was saying, like a lot of these tactics or way of approaching things aren't new, like they may have evolved slightly. So naturally the NYPD was opposed to the Post Act, and they were like, oh, we, you know, anti-terrorism. Now we're like basically showing like, you know, the world our hand. And then a part of like the bundle of testimony was another group who just like called them out. It was just basically like, we, you know, did a FOIA request, and basically like every time you know, did surveillance technology, like it wasn't for anti-terrorism, it was for homicides and like, you know, misdemeanors and things like that. So, you know, looking and seeing like the patterns of like using fear as a tactic, using like words like terrorism as a tactic to get people to not have an issue with like having these technologies existing and complying with what's happening, and like how that's not a new sentiment. So like some of my research has kind of been like, you know, going back to some of the things that have occurred like time and time and again throughout history. And I think that those threads are also telling too, because then it allows me to critique it in the same way. And it was like, well, you know, folks that knew that their phone might be being tapped, that in, you know, like Cynthia said that quote earlier about going to the bathroom, you still close the door, right? It didn't stop people from using the phone. But, you know, if you were an activist, if you were a member of a political party, it definitely changed the way that you went about doing things, right? And I think that's the same way that organizers are responding to doing things now. So I think it's also like remembering, like as you're doing research, like Todd said, a lot of these things and tactics aren't new. They're just like somewhat reinvented.
Okay. All right.
And I guess I can add to that in terms of two parts. The first one is in terms of specific research methods that you might want to look through and potentially uncover information of police technology and what they're adopting. So I have three. The first one is looking at if there's a website where you can access government procurement contracts. I know that sounds like the most boring thing ever, but it's actually kind of an underrated method because they have to acquire these technologies somehow. And there's a process in place whenever a government buys something, product or service, there's a whole procurement bureaucracy in place. And so a lot of times with the RCMP social media surveillance, for instance, they had to post a request for that publicly and they had to list everything they wanted. You got to see who was applying, you got to see who they awarded the contract to. And then once you have that information, then you can actually feed that into an FOI, where in the FOI, instead of saying anything on predictive policing, you can cite the actual contract or the actual name of the company and then see what you get back. The second thing I would suggest on a similar vein is looking at lobby registries. So with one specific example being ShotSpotter, which is an AI gun detection system and based in the States. The Toronto Police Service was considering adopting it at one point, and they decided not to after public outcry. But if you look on the Toronto lobbying registry, ShotSpotter lobbyists were registered maybe a year, 1.5 years before, again, we found out they were even considering adopting ShotSpotter. And I've heard that they've been quite aggressive with lobbying city councils in the States in particular. So that's another thing to see maybe kind of what companies are, maybe it's not actually the government or state agency who thought of this on their own. It could actually be these police tech vendors that are pushing it, that are giving the hard sell, and that's how this tech ends up getting adopted. And then the final avenue that I would suggest, which we also utilize in our report, is talking to criminal defense attorneys, because there are multiple instances, if you look like IMSI catchers and cell site simulators for one, not AI, but police surveillance tech. And one of the chat surveillance texts in our reports was discovered only because criminal lawyers, because it came up in their client's case. And there was no other documentation whatsoever, no public documentation. It's just in the course of defending their client, they had to go through the disclosure process and then found out what's this thing the police are referring to, did some more digging, and then found out, wow, this is a new type of tech that nobody has ever heard of before. And so that is also a thread that would be worth pulling on.
Okay. Thank you very much, all three of you. And there's another question, and I think it's directed at Todd, but I think it's relevant for everybody. And it's about, you know, sort of our attitudes to social media today. So the person is asking, you know, that the fact that the young people you're encountering, for example, Todd, are not really concerned about, you know, with their social media appearance, could that be because, you know, their lives now are, you know, our lives are so much more on, you know, on these public platforms than ever before, that we've kind of become used to, we've kind of given up, you know, some level of privacy in return for you know, use of this media. So could it be that, you know, your participants and others, you know, Cynthia, you were talking about people who say, you know, they don't really care if, you know, they're being surveyed. Could it be that our attitudes to social media are also influencing these kinds of, you know, responses to surveillance? The kind of, you know, people are not as concerned as maybe they need to be?
Yeah, I think there are a few different things to that, or a couple at least. I hear that. That's typically the way that I think about social media and engage with it. It's just like being a little bit more critical and a little bit more skeptical. But you know, it's just not the world that young people live in. You know, you feel me? And also importantly, there are a lot of sacrifices of personal privacy for life opportunities, right? And I think that's one of the things that I'm kind of like speaking to, And I mentioned a little bit earlier, the unfair expectation that kids would change up, you know, who they're kicking it with, making their art and whatnot. They're not going to do that. And again, it's not just because of the music, it's just because this is a life opportunity. These are the ways that a lot of kids actually look at their ability to, in the face of like less and less opportunities to like make moves in their lives, becoming like this whole thing of like the online attention economy and becoming like a micro celebrity. For a lot of young people, this is a legitimate way of actually making moves in your life. And yeah, this is how you live. This is how you're not just going to survive, but this is how you can potentially like thrive in the future. And so it's totally like a point well taken of just like a lot of our attitudes toward like social media can be like a little bit too lax. But at the same time, I think we have to acknowledge like the world that we actually do live in, where a lot of interaction, a lot of opportunities actually does revolve around people posting, people sharing, people putting things out there. So yeah, I guess that's my way of saying like, yeah, regarding the question, I totally feel that, but I don't know, like going like now and going forward, it just seems like the world that we're living in is where people are going to be, lack of a better word, like volunteering a lot of this personal information for things that they want to do with their life. And I think again, it's like instructive to try and figure out how to live in that type of world.
Well, and I mean, I think, you know, as Black people, as you were saying at the start of your presentation, Todd, it's like being surveyed is something you live with as a fact of life. Yeah. Right? So it's not as if it's a discovery. It's not as if it's a change. It's a part of your existence. Yeah. And so anyway, so interesting. Thank you for responding to that. Cynthia, did you want to say anything about
Sure. So I would just reiterate again the work of Val Steve and Jane Bailey and at Dana Boyd as well in the States at Dan and Society, because I think it's actually kind of a stereotype that older generations have of younger generations, that they don't care about privacy, and it's a really dangerous one. They look, and because I guess younger people are publishing more on social media than they might, it's almost as if they're applying an all or nothing concept to it. Whereas you either publish everything or you publish nothing. And as soon as you publish one thing, you just like waive all your rights to privacy, which is not true. It's not true in a normative sense, in a conceptual sense. And it's also not true according to the Supreme Court of Canada. Like they've said that privacy is not an all or nothing concept. And again, it's not about secrecy. It's about when in these interviews, at least the studies that I've read that I've actually interviewed and spoken to people in high school or younger, privacy is not about secrecy. It's about control and choice. So yes, someone may have an Instagram account that they post pictures that someone older may not post, but that's not all there is to it. It's actually, they have two Instagram accounts to very different audiences. And that is a form of them exercising the right to privacy. That control over to which audience they share what particular type of content is them exercising their privacy right. All of that content is still, it's not secret, it's still published to some sort of audience, but the fact that they can choose and control when, where, how, and to whom, that's what privacy comes to. It's not, do I hide it or not? It's what kind of control do I have over it? And the fact that kids seem to be not care as much privacy. So first, that is wrong. Second, to the extent that it seems that way, if it is a problem, that doesn't mean we're just supposed to roll over and give up and accept it. Because again, recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada, privacy and the reasonable expectation of privacy that grounds our rights as against the state, for example, is not a descriptive concept. It's a normative concept. It's not, what are the reasonable expectation of privacy that we have, knowing that we have basically none with respect to Facebook and Google and police surveillance. It's what should be, what ought to be our reasonable expectation of privacy in a free and democratic society. And that's what we should be aiming for. So if it is the case, if someone does do that research, speak to the children and teens and find, oh, they genuinely don't care about privacy, which you said it's wrong, but for sake of argument, let's say that's the case, then we have to change that. Then we have to go in and teach people to care about privacy again and why it's important. So it's like, just like we would want people to have civic literacy and media literacy, we would also want them to have literacy with respect to human rights and what it means to maintain and exercise them in a digitized world.
Right. and you're making me think that I suppose as these, the more we get used to these technologies, the more maybe we take precautions, the more
Right.
we, adapt to them in ways that,
Because there's a question of technological determinism too. Just because the technology is here, again, does not mean that we are now locked into it, right? That's the whole reason that we exist in this space, that there are advocates and researchers and lawyers is to not just say, well, the technology is here now. Like we have to preserve the ability to say no, is what it comes down to.
Okay. Thank you. Bría, we have a few minutes left. Would you like to answer that question, or don't have to?
Yeah, no, Cynthia had really hit what I was just thinking, just in terms of like digital literacy. And I think people getting frustrated, like what are children actually getting taught in school, right? Like what do their curriculums look like? And then, we get upset when they become adults and they go out into the real world and like, how come you can't engage this way, or the way that they behave when they're in high school, like, oh, how come you don't understand? And so I think that there are even adults who don't fully kind of like understand how their privacy information and things are being shared. And I think that to me, it's like a learning and like education piece and like an opportunity to try to understand, because I think it's happening to us and we've kind of just accepted that it's happening. And then maybe like the questioning part, I think it's like, well, what questions to even ask, I think is a place to start in understanding like, what should I be looking out for? But I, get like a little upset at kind of like, be like, oh, the kids are doing this and they're doing that. And they're hyper aware. They're super aware and they understand, right? But particularly with Black and Brown youth, like Todd's been mentioning, every day is surveillance, right? Walking to let's pre-COVID-19 for instance. I went to public school in New York City. You're on your way, to the train station to go to school. There's police officers at the corner at the train station. Maybe you go to a high school where you have to go through a metal detector, or you can't take your phone in with you, so you have to leave it with them. There's, school safety officers in your school who are monitoring your behavior and what you do at every moment. So a lot of these kids, if you will, have fatigue. They're fatigued. And then they're being critiqued on the way that they use digital, social media, which is like, maybe they're one of few outlets. So I think that that's important to consider too.
Okay. Thank you all. So this session ends at noon. It doesn't look like we have any other questions from the audience. So I'm sure we could take the entire day to go into more depth about these issues. I have many more questions I would ask you guys, but maybe just to close, well, I'll leave it up to you actually. What would you like to say to the audience in closing? Anything? Final thoughts? No?
I just had an alarm go off. Yeah, I think this is less about like the research that I'm doing, but just about some of the questions that we were fielding. It's just like, I think it's important just to engage, especially like young people, about this type of stuff. And hope just like take it like even just like leaving this talk, this webinar right now, and just thinking about things and just bring it up with like the young people in your life, wherever they are, just talking about these things.
Anybody else want to say some final words?
Sure. I guess this actually echoes something Bría and Todd said earlier, which is that these new technologies are really just reiterations of old technologies in terms of their underlying logic. And that echoes a lot of what the racial justice activists and human rights defenders said in our research, where even if they hadn't heard of the technology before we brought it to them, if they didn't know police in Canada were using facial recognition or had heard of predictive policing before, they could still immediately recognize what the problems with these technologies were because they're so familiar with the dynamics. And so one of the people we interviewed, Desmond Cole, who's a really high-profile journalist and racial justice activist in Canada, said that he draws a direct line, essentially, from the former ways that state violence was justified against Black and Brown people to current ways they're being justified. And he said, where in the past they would have used pen and paper or a little notebook And then a few years ago, they would have used the little cards for carding in Toronto. Now they're using an algorithm. And so by that token, so then that also makes me think of the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition published a great report called Before the Bullet Hits the Body. And they just do a really good job articulating how in some ways these technologies are almost beside the point. And that goes to the question of having to look at what is the actual root of community well-being and lack of well-being, and will technology solve that problem? So they said the goal is not to make a perfect version of Operation Laser, which is the predictive policing program that's happening in LAPD. It's to look at the underlying issues. It's the goal is not the perfect algorithm. The goal is affordable healthcare and affordable education and housing, because those are the factors of community well-being. And so we have to be careful not to, obviously, while all three of us are spending our lives looking at technology because it's so important and it does shape society and our rights, we have to also be careful that it doesn't become the entire conversation, because ultimately it speaks to problems that themselves are beyond the purview of technology.
Wonderful. I think that's a wonderful ending, Cynthia. Bría, do you want to say anything before we close?
Just real quickly, this has just been really wonderful in hearing everyone talk. And I always think about this James Baldwin quote where he talks about the fact that he loves America so fiercely, and for that reason, he insists on critiquing it. And I think it's important, no matter you're an academic, a community member, a young person, that you engage in critiquing what's going on. And then, of course, re-envisioning what we want our future to look like.
Go from specific to broad, and on a encouraging note. Thank you all so very much for your work, for your insights, for your incredible talks, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to learn more from you in the future, because you're here with us for a year. Is that right, Bría and Todd? At least from New York, you're going to be feeding back to Toronto or Canada at some point, right?
Yeah, so 6 months.
Okay. No pressure. All right. And Cynthia is as permanent member, or at least also part of the Citizen Lab in the next year. Is that right, Cynthia? You guys are?
Yes, I will be there for 2021.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so on that note, we'll close, and I wish you all the very best. And I thank you, members of the audience, for spending the time with us.
Thank you.